Chapter 1: A Land Between Worlds. Before there was empire, before the name of Alexander echoed across 3 continents, there was only land. Wild, wind-worn, and distant. Macedonia, an ancient frontier tucked between civilizations, sat like a quiet breath between giants. To the south, the proud and polished cities of Greece, where marble temples reached for the gods and philosophers debated under fig trees. To the north, the untamed forests of the Balkans, where rivers wound through valleys like serpents and tribes moved with the seasons like whispers on the wind. Macedonia was neither, and it was both. This northern frontier did not glitter. It did not sing epics or crown poets. It brooded in stone silence. Here, jagged mountains carved through the sky like teeth, their snow-streaked peaks catching the morning sun in fragments. Wolves howled at night, and mists coiled through pine trees like smoke from an unseen fire. The soil was iron dark and rich with silence. The people who lived here did not see themselves as Greeks, nor did they fully belong to the wild north. They were mountain people, farmers and herders, iron workers and hunters, and sometimes, when the moon was high and the borderland stirred, they were warriors. They lived in small villages with wooden palisades and dark hearths, warmed more by stories than comfort. Their lives were ruled by the rhythm of the land, the freeze of winter, the blaze of summer, the endless cycle of toil and fight. But to the Greeks they were outsiders, half-civilized at best, barbarians with beards and rough dialects. The polished Athenians looked north and saw a wilderness. They missed what was growing in the shadows. Macedonia was not silent, it was waiting. Tribes of the highlands. Long before cities or strategy, Macedonia was a patchwork of tribes. These were not kingdoms, but clans. Kin-based, fiercely loyal, and always ready for war. Their loyalties flowed not to ideas, but to blood, to fathers and brothers, to chieftains and lineages whispered through generations. In the highlands, memory was oral. Stories passed from fire to fire. Tales of ancestors, spirits, and battles long forgotten by the world. They did not write history, they carried it in their bones. Life in these tribes was hard, but proud. The men were forged by the cold, taught to hunt and fight before they could read. Their strength was not measured in scrolls or rhetoric, but in scars. A good warrior was Dull, praised not for his words, but for the silence with which he endured pain. Honor was a blade kept sharp with blood. And yet there was something noble in their roughness, a dignity that came not from riches or temples, but from survival. The women of these tribes were no less strong. They bore children in winter, wove cloth in storms, and kept the old tales alive when men did not return from raids. Their wisdom ran deep, an understanding of the land, of herbs and healing, of grief and endurance. In their songs the past never died. Each tribe had its own customs. Some painted their faces before battle, some buried their dead beneath oak trees, others left offerings to unknown gods in mountain caves. Yet, despite these differences, they shared a spirit, a restlessness, a hunger, a sense that they were not meant to stay small forever. This was the Macedonia before empire, not a nation, but a collection of shadows flickering on stone walls, and among them, sparks. Kings without crowns, In time, as tribes grew and boundaries blurred, certain leaders began to rise, men who were more than chieftains, but less than kings. They held power, not through laws, but loyalty. Not through thrones, but through the weight of their names. These early rulers of Macedonia were warriors first. They led from the front, bled beside their men, and earned every ounce of authority. In battle, they wore no crowns of gold. Instead, their mark of rule was a sword sharpened by victories. They held feasts in wooden halls and sat on carved stools by the fire, speaking in the voice of fathers, not gods. Their rule was fragile. The tribes still murmured. Alliances could shift with the season. Rebellions flickered like embers. To rule here was to constantly hold back the wild, both in the land and in men's hearts. Diplomacy was not conducted with parchment, but with promises sealed in blood or marriage, and betrayal was always just over the hill. These rulers walked a tightrope between the world of the Greeks and the chaos of the north. They sent emissaries to Athens, hoping to gain recognition. Sometimes they adopted Greek customs, used their language, worshipped their gods, even claimed descent from Heracles to earn respect. Yet the Greeks remained skeptical. To them, Macedonia was a land of half-men ruled by warlords, pretenders, not peers, but these kings without crowns knew something deeper. They knew the land, they knew its people, and they knew that one day a man would come who could bind the wild into will, who could shape the shadow into form. The age of warlords was only the beginning. A storm was gathering, and at its eye, a throne was slowly being carved from stone. And silence. The forgotten kingdom. For centuries, Macedonia remained a whisper on the edge of the ancient world. Other empires rose and fell. Persia thundered eastward. Athens built its Parthenon. Sparta marched in formation. But Macedonia stayed still. Historians from the south wrote little about it. Maps marked it vaguely. To the world, it was a backwater, a mountain realm with no philosophers, no playwrights, no shining cities, a land of raw men and harder winters. Even when its kings began to unify the tribes, even when a fragile court emerged at Aigai with its first walls and shrines, the world barely noticed. But within its quiet, something rare was growing, not in splendor, but in strength. Macedonia was learning, slowly, stubbornly, through trial and failure. Its people were watching the Greeks, borrowing their armor, their formations, their tactics, but also holding fast to their own ways. The fierce loyalty of clans, the grit of mountain war, the pride of hardship. Its kings began to think not just as chieftains, but as rulers. They dreamed of something more than defense. They dreamed of unity, of purpose, of legacy. Still, the world laughed. When Macedonia sent ambassadors to the Olympic Games, they were questioned. Were they Greek enough to compete? Were they civilized? Even when Philip II, years later, would take the throne and forge a new army from these hills, many in the south still scoffed. Macedonia, a power, they had not seen the roots growing beneath the forest floor. This forgotten kingdom, quiet and underestimated, was preparing. It gathered like a bowstring pulled tight. And when it finally released, when Alexander rode out with his eyes fixed on the horizon, the world would finally turn its gaze north. But in this beginning, this land between worlds, there was only silence, stone, and the steady heartbeat of a people who had waited too long to be overlooked. Chapter 2. The Rise of a Warrior King, Philip II. Before he was a king, before he was feared or admired, Philip was just a boy, lost far from home, swallowed by the city of Thebes. It was the year 368 BCE. Macedonia was weak, torn by clan rivalries and foreign threats. Philip, the youngest son of King Amyntas III, had been sent away as a hostage, not for punishment, but as part of a diplomatic deal, a human pledge of peace. He was just 13 when he arrived in the heart of Greece. To the Macedonians, this exile may have seemed like shame. But to Philip, Thebes was a school unlike any other. Thebes at the time stood at the peak of military brilliance. It had defeated Sparta, shocked the Greek world, and was home to Epaminondas, the man many believed to be the greatest general alive. And in this city of walls, theatres, and training grounds, Philip watched, he listened, he learned. While other boys played games, Philip studied formations. He followed the elite sacred band of Thebes, an army of warrior lovers, bound by loyalty and trained to perfection. He observed their tactics, how they moved like one body, how they trusted one another completely. He memorized their discipline. He listened to philosophers debate in the agora. He studied Greek politics, saw how cities were held not only by swords but by persuasion. He learned how to command without shouting, how to lead by understanding men's fears and dreams. For 3 years, Philip lived among those who once would have been his enemies. But he did not waste the time. When he returned to Macedonia, he brought more than stories. He brought vision and steel. That boy, once a hostage, was already becoming something else, a shadow of the king he would soon become, unifier of the fractured tribes. When Philip returned to Macedonia in 365 BCE, the land was in ruins. The throne was unstable, the tribes were at war with each other. Foreign powers, Illyrians, Thracians, Greeks, hovered at the edges, eager to carve up the land like wolves around a dying stag. Macedonia, for all its history, was on the brink of disappearing. Then in 359 BCE, tragedy struck. King Perdiccas III, Philip's older brother, was killed in battle against the Illyrians. The army was shattered. The kingdom panicked. Philip, only in his early 20s, was named regent for the infant heir, his nephew. But Philip knew the truth. There was no time for ceremonies. If he did not act swiftly, Macedonia would fall. So he did what few dared. He claimed the crown for himself. His first act was survival. He bribed invaders with gold, made temporary peace with nearby powers, and bought time. Then, step by step, he turned to war. Philip moved like a hammer. He crushed rival claimants to the throne. He rode into tribal lands not with empty promises but with fire and force. Villages that resisted were razed. Chiefs who submitted were spared and made allies. He married their daughters. He shared feasts. He broke bread with one hand and held a sword in the other. Within a few short years, the fractured clans that had fought for generations stood under one banner, his. Not because they were suddenly peaceful, but because Philip had made rebellion impossible. He reorganized the court, rebuilt the capital, and planted spies in every corner of the land. Loyalty was rewarded, defiance silenced. Where once stood 10 kings, now there was one. Philip, once a boy hostage, was now master of Macedonia, The wolves had backed away, and for the first time in a very long time, the kingdom was quiet. The army reforged power is never safe without force. Philip knew this. The old Macedonian army had been brave, but scattered, good for skirmishes, not for empire. Their weapons were outdated, their tactics were broken. Philip had seen better. In Thebes, he had watched soldiers move like water, flowing together, unbreakable. Now he would bring that vision to life. He began with the phalanx. This was no ordinary wall of spears. Philip's soldiers carried the sarissa, a massive pike nearly 18 feet long. It was unwieldy, yes, but terrifying. When hundreds of men stood shoulder to shoulder, their spears formed a moving forest. Nothing could break through. No cavalry dared charge it. It was a machine made of men, but weapons alone were not enough. Philip trained his army year-round, not just for war, but for endurance, silence, discipline. He demanded precision. His soldiers learned to march in step, to pivot without command, to move as one. He taught them signals, formations, tricks of terrain. He gave them new helmets, lighter shields, stronger armor. He turned peasants into professionals, and he paid them regularly. War was no longer a duty. It was a career, a future. For the first time in Macedonian history, men fought not just for land, but for something larger, a dream. He built cavalry units, swift and brutal, and placed his most trusted nobles in command. He created siege engineers, fortified borders, drilled strategies that confused and crushed enemies in the field. Soon, his army was the envy of Greece. Whispers spread through Athens and Sparta. Who was this northern king with such perfect formations? How had the barbarians built a military so modern? The answer was simple. They hadn't. Philip had. The phalanx was his blade, and now he was ready to point it outward. Dreams beyond the mountains. By the time Philip stood fully in power, Macedonia was no longer a fractured land. It was a spear pointed south. Greece, once the center of the ancient world, had grown tired. Its city-states fought endlessly, wasting men and gold over pride and borders. Athens envied Sparta. Thebes distrusted Corinth. No one trusted anyone. And while they argued, Philip grew stronger. He began with diplomacy. He sent gold and gifts to Greek cities, flattered their leaders, pretended to be their friend. He offered to mediate disputes, to protect temples, to help maintain peace. But behind the smiles, Philip's armies marched. He moved into Thessaly, into Thrace, into cities that once mocked Macedonia as a backwater. He brought roads and order, but also garrisons, walls, watchmen. Resistance was crushed. Obedience was rewarded. In 338 BCE, the Greek city-states finally realized the threat. They formed an alliance. Athens and Thebes, enemies for so long, now stood together to stop Philip. At Chaeronea, their armies clashed. The battle was swift. The Macedonian phalanx held firm. Philip's cavalry, led by his son Alexander, then only 18, smashed through the Greek lines. Thebes was broken. Athens surrendered. Greece had fallen, not to Persians, not to invaders from across the sea, but to a man from the mountains. Philip, the former hostage, now stood as master of the Greek world. But he was not finished. In his halls at Aigai, maps stretched across tables, maps of the East, of Persia, of Babylon, of riches and empires beyond the sea. Philip began to plan a war unlike any the Greeks had seen. He called it a campaign of revenge for what Persia had done to Greece generations earlier. But it was more than that. It was destiny. He would cross the Hellespont, march into Asia, burn the name of Macedonia into the world. He did not live to see it. In 336 BCE, at a royal celebration, Philip was murdered, stabbed by a former bodyguard. The court erupted in chaos, but his son would take the dream even further, for Philip had built the world's sharpest sword, and Alexander would be the one to swing it. Chapter 3. Greece falls silent. In the heart of the ancient world, the Greek city-states lived in constant motion. They argued, they voted, they fought wars, they signed treaties and broke them. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, each saw itself as the center of civilization. None could imagine kneeling to another, least of all to a man from the north. But Philip of Macedonia did not need them to kneel. Not at first. He arrived like a breeze slipping under a door, quiet but undeniable. His face smiled, his words soothed. But in his shadow came the steel of the phalanx. His diplomacy did not end with handshakes. It began with them. Philip understood men. He understood pride. He knew that many Greek cities were more afraid of each other than of outsiders, so he played the old rivalries like a lyre. When Athens bristled, he flattered Sparta. When Thebes hesitated, he offered alliances elsewhere. He divided where he could not yet conquer, and he offered something few rulers did: stability. To some cities, Philip brought gifts. Trade agreements, marriages that bound noble houses to his own. He took wives from Thessaly, Epirus, Illyria, each union sealing a fragile peace. He did not demand obedience at first, only friendship. But friendship with Philip always came with a price. To other cities, he offered peace or war. He appeared at their borders with an army that did not waver. He gave them a choice. Some fought and fell. Others opened their gates. In every city he touched, he left behind something. A garrison, a treaty, a child raised in his court. And all across Greece, the whisper began to spread. This was not the Macedonia of old. Philip was not just a conqueror, he was a gardener, and what he planted, he carefully pruned until all of Greece began to grow in his direction. The Battle of Chæronea. But diplomacy, no matter how elegant, has limits. There always comes a moment when words falter. And at Chæronea, that moment arrived. It was 338 BCE. The Greek city-states had begun to see Philip for what he was, not a mediator, but a rising master. For years he had taken cities, turned friends against each other, and grown stronger in the silence between battles. Finally, Athens and Thebes set aside their bitterness. They would fight him. Together, they met at a quiet plain near the town of Chæronea in central Greece. The land was open, the air heavy with expectation. On one side stood the combined forces of Greece, proud and determined. On the other, the Macedonian army, disciplined and strange. Among them stood Philip's 18-year-old son, Alexander, watching, learning, waiting. The Greeks had numbers, they had passion, but they did not have Philip's mind. He placed his phalanx in the center, rows of men with impossibly long spears, their movements like clockwork. On the wings, his cavalry. He knew the terrain. He knew their weaknesses. And he let the Greeks believe they were winning. Philip slowly gave ground, not because he was losing, but because he was leading them deeper into position. And then, when the center buckled just enough, he struck. The Macedonian cavalry, with Alexander at the lead, charged the Theban flank. Like lightning through dry wood, the line snapped. Panic spread, men shouted, shields dropped. The sacred band of Thebes, once invincible, was cut down where it stood. Shoulder to shoulder, they died together, refusing to break even in defeat. At sunset, the battle was over. The field was silent. So was Greece. Athens sued for peace. Thebes was occupied. Across the city-states, walls trembled, not from war, but from the knowledge that the age of independent Greece was ending, and at the center of it all stood Philip, calm and calculating, as if the whole thing had been inevitable. The League of Corinth Philip had won Greece, but he did not want to rule it like a tyrant. He was cleverer than that. In 337 BCE, he summoned the leaders of the Greek world to the city of Corinth, not to kneel, but to unite. There he proposed something strange, a league, a federation of Greek states under a shared oath. Each city would remain sovereign. Each would keep its customs, its gods, its pride. But all would follow one leader, one commander, one purpose. That leader was Philip. He called it the Hellenic League, or more often, the League of Corinth. It was the first time in history that the fractious Greek cities were bound together in one political and military body, not by choice alone, but by fear and by hope. Philip offered them a mission, a noble goal, revenge. He spoke of Persia, the great empire to the east, the old enemy, the one who had burned Athens, who had once tried to enslave all of Greece. He promised to lead them across the sea, not to conquer for himself, but to avenge a century of wounds, and many believed him. He left Corinth with pledges of troops, resources, ships. For the first time, Greece would march as one, not because they loved each other, but because Philip had shown them something they had never seen before: unity through strength. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Sparta refused to join. Others grumbled. But they were too few. Too late, the league was formed. The war against Persia was set. And Philip, king of a once-forgotten land, now stood at the head of the greatest coalition Greece had ever seen. He had taken the sword of conquest and turned it into a pen of peace. But behind the ink, the blade remained sharp. The ghost of empire. As preparations for the Persian War began, the halls of Aigai buzzed with energy. Messengers rode in from distant cities. Armories rang with the sound of steel. Ships were constructed. Along the Aegean coast, everything pointed east, to Asia, to destiny. And yet, inside the palace, something else stirred. Philip was no longer the young warrior he once was. He had grown heavier. His limp, earned in battle years ago, slowed him. But his mind was still quick. His ambitions sharper than ever. He had built an empire not with one blow, but brick by brick. He had outwitted kings, outmarched generals, outlasted rivals. And now, with Greece under his belt, he turned his eyes to Persia. It was a dream, yes, but not a fantasy. He had the men, the gold, the backing of the cities. He believed it could be done, and so did many around him. But dreams, no matter how carefully crafted, remain fragile. In 336 BCE, during a grand celebration at Aigai, his daughter's wedding, a moment of triumph, Philip walked proudly into the theatre, surrounded by nobles and guards. He wore no armor, he was at peace. The crowd cheered, and then, without warning, a man stepped forward. A blade flashed. Philip fell. He died before he hit the ground. Panic exploded. The assassin, a former bodyguard, was chased and killed. Rumors spread like fire, one to revenge. About conspiracies, about betrayal from within. But the truth was simple. The man who had built a kingdom would not see it sail. His son Alexander, just 20 years old, now inherited an empire balanced on the edge of greatness. Philip had laid every stone, sharpened every sword, written the beginning of a story that only someone extraordinary could finish. And somewhere far beyond the mountains, Persia waited. The ghost of Philip's empire had only just begun to whisper. Chapter 4. Alexander, born of gods and men. Before the conquests, before the battles and empires, there was a child born in thunder and fire, or so the stories say. In 356 BCE, on a warm summer night in the Macedonian capital of Pella, Queen Olympias gave birth to a son. That same night, they say, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, far away in Asia Minor, was consumed in flames. The priestesses, stunned by the sudden blaze, whispered of an omen. Something powerful had entered the world. The child was named Alexander. To the world he was born of Philip II, king of Macedonia. But Olympias, the queen, told a different tale, a sacred one. She claimed that one night, while asleep, she was visited by a serpent, a divine presence. Some said it was Zeus himself, god of gods, who had entered her chambers and left her carrying something more than human. Philip, upon hearing this, remained silent. But he was no stranger to prophecy. In his dreams he claimed to have seen his wife's womb sealed by a lion, a symbol of greatness and divine favor. The oracles were consulted, the signs were read, and all pointed to the same truth. This child would be unlike any other. From his earliest days, Alexander was told he was special, not just a prince, but something more, the son of heroes. The blood of Achilles pulsed in his veins, they said, descended from Heracles, guided by Zeus. A boy chosen not by birthright alone, but by fate. The palace at Pella, once echoing with the sounds of war councils and soldiers' boots, now held its breath around a cradle. The future stirred, wrapped in linen and mystery. Alexander grew not in the shadow of men, but in the light of myth, tutored by titans. As Alexander grew, his education became a matter of state and of legend. Philip spared no expense. He believed the mind was as vital as the sword. And for a boy destined to rule the world, only the greatest minds would suffice. First came the early lessons: music, poetry, horseback riding, and survival. Alexander excelled. He absorbed stories like water, recited Homer by heart, and practiced spear play with unmatched hunger. But soon his intellect demanded more. So Philip summoned a philosopher. Not just any teacher, but Aristotle, Already famous in Athens, Aristotle was a disciple of Plato, a thinker who had studied the cosmos, nature, politics, and the soul. He agreed to come north on one condition, that Philip rebuild his hometown of Stazyra, which Philip had once destroyed. The king agreed, and so in a grove near Mieza, under the whispering shade of trees, Aristotle taught the prince. There, Alexander learned the balance of opposites, logic and feeling, reason and war. He studied science from the stars above to the earth beneath. He debated the nature of justice, the role of kings, the purpose of life. He read of Persia, India, Egypt, lands he would one day walk upon as a conqueror. Aristotle gave him more than facts. He gave him vision, the idea that the world could be understood and ruled by those with knowledge and will. The prince asked questions no child should ask, about gods, about fate, about the limits of man. And quietly, as he listened, something was forming, not just a king, but a force. When lessons ended, Alexander often returned to his favorites, the Iliad, the Odyssey. He kept a copy of Homer by his bed. In Achilles, he saw not a story, but a mirror. He was not learning to be king of Macedonia. He was preparing to lead the world. A prince of fire. Even as a boy, Alexander burned. He was not gentle, not obedient, not ordinary. Where others his age played at war, he studied real battles. Where other boys listened, he argued, he was fearless and often reckless. His mother fed him stories of his divine blood, and he believed them. He did not walk, he marched. He did not speak, he commanded. At just 12, he was given a challenge. That would define his early legend. A massive horse had been brought to the palace. Wild, black, untamed. No one could ride it. It bucked and reared, sending even skilled riders into the dust. Philip was about to send it away, but Alexander stepped forward. He studied the horse, watched its movements, and then softly he turned it toward the sun. He had noticed the horse was afraid of its own shadow. Speaking gently, he mounted. The horse calmed. They rode together like wind through grass. The court was silent. Philip, astonished, said, "My son, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small." The horse was named Bucephalus. He would ride with Alexander across half the world, but the fire in the prince burned hotter than praise. As he grew, so did the rift between father and son. Philip had many wives, many sons, and his ambition was growing beyond his family. He married a noblewoman from a rival house, which threatened Alexander's claim. At the wedding feast, Alexander confronted him, furious. Words turned to shouts. A sword was drawn. Philip, drunk, stumbled. The court watched, breathless. Alexander left the palace. For months he wandered, exiled by his own blood, but he returned. And when Philip was assassinated, many believed Olympias had a hand. Alexander took the throne. Not with grief, but with purpose. He was no longer just a prince. He was destiny walking, the making of a god-king. Myths are not always born after greatness. Sometimes they shape it before it begins. Alexander knew this. From the start, he walked with legends at his side. He surrounded himself with symbols: Achilles, Heracles, Zeus. He wore the lion's pelt. He sacrificed to gods. But more than that, he began to believe he was one of them. When he became king at age 20, many doubted him. Too young, too impulsive, too wild. But within months, he silenced rebellion in the north, burned a city to the ground, and rode 300 miles in 11 days to stop another uprising. The boy had become a storm. And yet he remained calm in public, composed, controlled. He held councils, issued decrees, and preserved his father's legacy. But behind his eyes was something ancient, a hunger, not for gold or land, but for memory. He wanted to be remembered, and not just as a man, so he shaped his own myth. He visited temples, spoke with oracles, invoked his divine lineage. In Egypt, he would later be declared the son of Ammon, another name for Zeus. In Persia, he would wear royal robes. In Babylon, they would call him a god, but long before any of that, before Asia, before Darius, before the Indus, he had already decided who he was. He was not content with being Philip's heir. He was born of gods. And he would live like one. His face would be carved into marble. His name etched into maps. His story passed from mouth to mouth, like fire lighting the dark. In a palace built of stone and shadow, a boy once listened to tales of heroes. Now the world would listen to his. Chapter 5. The sword ascends. Alexander takes the throne. The silence after Philip's death did not last long. In the year 336 BCE, the grand court at Aigai had gathered for celebration. The wedding of Philip's daughter. The theatre was full, the nobles dressed in gold and crimson, the scent of burning incense rising to the open Macedonian skies. Then, in a flash, everything shattered. A lone assassin, Pausanias, stepped from the crowd. With a hidden blade, he struck the king through the ribs. Philip fell, blood spreading across the dust. The crowd erupted, panic took hold, and within minutes, Macedonia's most powerful man, the architect of unity, the builder of empire, was gone. No one knew what would come next. The assassination of a king was never just a crime. It was a signal to allies, to enemies, to rivals. In a kingdom still young in its unity, where clans remembered ancient grudges and nobles whispered in private halls, Philip's death was an invitation to chaos. And chaos came. There were rumors that Olympias, Alexander's mother, had orchestrated the murder. Others said foreign powers had pulled strings. But gossip didn't matter. What mattered was this: Philip was dead, and his 20-year-old son now stood on the brink of a throne drenched in uncertainty. Alexander had spent his youth preparing for greatness, but now, suddenly, he was burdened with survival. Even before he could bury his father, threats began to rise. In the courts, rival factions stirred. In the provinces, minor kings tested the limits of loyalty. From Athens came mocking silence. From Thebes, thinly veiled defiance. Across the northern border, tribes sharpened their blades. To many, Alexander was just a boy, an idealist, a dreamer, a prince raised on myths and mothers' tales. Macedonia had known warlords, it had known warriors. But could it follow a young man still untested in the hard art of ruling? There was doubt. And where there is doubt, ambition awakens. Within weeks, enemies began to gather like clouds around the throne. Macedonia, once united by the iron will of Philip, was again drifting toward fracture. The new king, young and watched by 1,000 skeptical eyes, would need more than his father's shadow to survive. He would need action, swift, decisive, and merciless. Blood and loyalty. Alexander understood one thing clearly. There could be no reign without fear. Even before his crown settled on his head, he moved. Quietly at first, then brutally. He summoned those closest to the throne, nobles, generals, advisors, and began to reshape the court in his image. Those who had opposed Philip's vision were removed. Those who doubted Alexander's right to rule were silenced, in some cases permanently. The most infamous blow came swiftly against Attalus, a powerful general and uncle to Philip's new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice. He had insulted Alexander publicly before the king's death, calling into question his legitimacy and bloodline. Now Alexander responded without hesitation. Attalus was executed, his supporters scattered. Cleopatra, Philip's widow, and her infant daughter, dead. Ordered by Olympius, perhaps, or permitted by the king himself. In the palace, screams were buried behind marble walls. There was no room for compromise. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy, a message, a ritual cleansing of the court. The message was clear. The past was buried with Philip, and any hand that reached for Alexander's crown would be cut off. He moved swiftly through Macedonia, securing the loyalty of nobles with gifts and threats. He offered command to trusted companions, men like Parmenion, Antipater, and Hephaestion. Youthful, bold, and deeply loyal, these men would become the pillars of Alexander's new court. To the soldiers, he spoke not as a boy but as a warrior. He reminded them of the victories they had won under Philip, and the victories they would win again. He promised them gold, glory, and conquest beyond imagination. And they followed. Through these actions, Alexander transformed the throne from a fragile seat into a throne of fire. He was no longer the prince standing in his father's shadow. He had stepped into the sun and burned away any challenge to his reign. But Macedonia was only the beginning. Crushing the northern rebellion, barely had the blood dried in the royal court when new threats rose from the wild northern frontiers. Tribes that had once submitted to Philip now sensed weakness in the land. From Thrace to Illyria, war drums echoed in the valleys. These were not foreign empires, but loose alliances of fierce mountain warriors, proud, independent, and always hungry for Macedonian weakness. They believed the new king would hesitate. He did not. In the early spring of 335 BCE, Alexander marched north. He did not wait for peace talks or ambassadors. He rode fast across frozen rivers and steep mountain passes with a force that struck before the enemy could blink. He fought not just to defend, but to dominate. In Thrace, he attacked the Triballi, fierce, nomadic warriors, and scattered their forces in days. Then he crossed the Danube, a feat no Macedonian king had ever attempted. There, under the shadow of thick forests and strange tongues, he faced the Getae and drove them back with brutal precision. News of his victories spread like fire through the highlands. In Illyria, he faced the powerful King Clytus, whose rebellion had drawn support from other tribes. Alexander responded with a siege, then a charge. He broke their alliance with force, routed their armies, and pursued their leaders into the hills. But the most dramatic moment came not in the battles, but after. On his return from the north, Alexander learned that Thebes, once humbled by Philip, had risen in revolt. The city had expelled his garrison and declared its freedom. Athens watched from the shadows, waiting to see what this young king would do. The world waited. Alexander did not hesitate. He turned his army south, marched straight to Thebes, and crushed the rebellion. He offered mercy. It was refused. He gave warning. It was mocked. So he answered with destruction. The city was sacked, its walls torn down, its people scattered or sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message was carved in stone. Macedonia would not be defied. The northern rebellion had been crushed. The south was silent. And Alexander, still barely more than a boy, now stood as master of all Greece, a dream inherited. In the quiet that followed Thebes' destruction, Alexander turned his gaze east. The Persian Empire loomed like a sleeping giant, vast, ancient, and mysterious. It stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of India, its cities filled with gold, its kings wrapped in silks and divine titles. For centuries, it had been the great rival of Greece and the ghost that haunted its memories. Philip had dreamed of invading Persia. He had built the League of Corinth, gathered allies, and planned the campaign. His maps still lay on marble tables in Aigai. His generals still spoke of it in hushed tones. His son had not forgotten. But now that dream was Alexander's to fulfill. He did not inherit it blindly. He believed in it deeply. To him, Persia was not just a prize. It was a calling, a challenge worthy of his lineage, a test of his divinity, the final measure of his greatness. He would cross the Hellespont not as a Macedonian king, but as a son of Zeus, a second Achilles, a god walking among mortals. Preparations began in the spring of 334 BCE. Troops were assembled, ships constructed, supplies gathered, messages sent to allies and vassals. The League of Corinth reaffirmed its oath. All of Greece would stand behind the war. As his army prepared to move, Alexander rode alone to the tomb of Achilles. There, by the sea, he laid offerings and wept. Not from sorrow, but from kinship. He believed his story would one day match the legend of that hero. And then at last, he crossed. A single spear was cast onto Asian soil. A symbolic gesture, a declaration. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus, silenced rebellions, and stepped over the bones of rivals, now stepped into the pages of history. The sword had ascended. The world would never be the same again. Chapter 6. Crossing into legend, the invasion of Asia. The water shimmered under a pale morning sun, as if it too was holding its breath. The sea between two worlds, known to the Greeks as the Hellespont, was not just a strait. It was a boundary between Europe and Asia, between memory and ambition, between the world that had been and the one Alexander was about to create. It was the spring of 334 BCE. The sky above was calm, but the moment below was electric. On the shores of the European side, tens of thousands of soldiers stood ready. Macedonians, Greeks, Thracians, veterans of Philip's wars and fresh-faced boys alike. They wore bronze helmets and bore the long sarissas that had already changed the rules of warfare. Their banners fluttered in the breeze, emblazoned with the star of Vagina. And at their head, young, serene, and filled with purpose, was their king, Alexander was 22 years old. But this was not a campaign. It was not even a war. It was a crossing into legend. Before boarding his ship, Alexander paused. He walked to the edge of the shore and cast a spear into the waves, letting it land on the opposite bank. A symbolic act, a declaration that he was claiming Asia not as a visitor, but as a conqueror. Then, as priests murmured prayers and soldiers looked on, he stepped aboard. His fleet sailed gently across the strait. It was not a long journey in distance, only a few miles of water, but in meaning it stretched across the soul of the ancient world. The boy born in Pella, raised on Homer's verses, now followed the path of Achilles and Heracles. Upon setting foot on Asian soil, Alexander knelt. He poured sacred libations, he offered sacrifices to the gods, and he carried with him a treasured copy of the Iliad annotated by Aristotle himself, a book he would keep beside his bed for years to come. This was not just conquest, it was pilgrimage. The sands beneath his boots were old. Persian kings had ruled these lands for centuries. Their banners flew over countless cities. Their palaces housed gold, silks, and mysteries. But Alexander did not hesitate. He had crossed the threshold, and there would be no return. The Battle of Granicus. Just weeks after landing in Asia, the young king was tested. The Persians had been watching. They knew Alexander had crossed the sea, and they met him at the river Granicus, a winding body of water slicing through the plains of Western Asia Minor. On the far bank, the Persian satraps had gathered. Satraps were regional governors, noblemen with power, resources, and Persian pride. They were not kings, but they believed they could stop one. They had cavalry, fast, well-trained, heavily armored. They had infantry in numbers, and they had the river itself. A natural barrier, they believed, would keep the invader at bay. But Alexander did not wait. Most commanders would have paused, rested their army, waited for a better moment to strike. But Alexander believed in momentum. He believed in daring, and above all, he believed in fate. He ordered an immediate assault. The Macedonian army advanced toward the Granicus under a cloudless sky. The river was swollen from spring rains, its current swift, but the soldiers pressed forward. First, the cavalry, Alexander himself leading the charge. He wore a gleaming white plume on his helmet so his men could always find him. As horses splashed into the cold water, Persian arrows filled the sky. The battle began. The Persians fought ferociously. They aimed for Alexander, recognizing him as the heart of the Macedonian force. He was nearly struck down by a Persian noble, but at the last second, Clytus the Black, one of his commanders, saved him with a single sword blow. On the riverbanks, the phalanx advanced with grim precision. The sarissas held firm. Macedonian discipline triumphed over Persian speed. Slowly, surely, the Persians broke. The field was soaked in blood, the air thick with dust and screams. But when it ended, the Macedonian banner stood alone. The Battle of Granicus was not a large battle by numbers, but symbolically it was everything. It was Alexander's first clash with Persia, and it had ended in total victory. The satraps fled. Cities along the western coast trembled. The myth of Persian invincibility had cracked, and Alexander, barely out of boyhood, had proven that his sword was not just sharp, it was destined. The gates to the empire had creaked open. The bridge to empire victory at Granicus did more than clear a riverbank. It changed everything. The Persian system of rule was built on hierarchy, on loyalty to a distant king, to gold, to protocol. When the satraps were defeated and their armies scattered, the structure wobbled. Without strong governors, cities were left exposed, garrisons lost morale, local rulers hesitated. Alexander moved swiftly. He did not behave like a mere conqueror. He behaved like a liberator, at least in the eyes of the Greek cities under Persian rule. In places like Sardis and Ephesus, he reinstated local democracies. He tore down Persian symbols. He honored local gods. In doing so, he turned fear into favor. Word spread quickly. The young king who had crossed the Hellespont was not here to destroy. He was here to restore. The Persian Empire, vast and stretched, had always ruled with a heavy hand. Taxes, garrisons, edicts from Susa and Persepolis. Now Alexander offered a different path, one of partnership, or at least the illusion of it, but to make no mistake, behind the open hand was a closed fist. Those who resisted him met ruin. Cities that refused surrender were stormed. Leaders who questioned his authority were replaced. The Macedonian army moved like a tide, overwhelming and constant. After Granicus, the road to the heart of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was open. Alexander did not rush. He advanced with care, garrisoning cities, securing supply lines, and ensuring loyalty at every step. He knew the Persian king Darius III would respond eventually, and when that moment came, he wanted to be ready, with allies behind him and no enemies at his back. The bridge to empire was not just military, it was strategic, it was political, it was psychological. Alexander was not merely winning battles, he was building the skeleton of something far greater. The march eastward begins with the western edge of Asia. Minor secured, Alexander turned east, toward the core of Persian power. The key terrain changed, the air grew hotter, the sun harsher, mountain ranges carved through the land like ancient scars. Cities appeared less Greek, more Persian, columns replaced by domes, tunics by robes. The deeper Alexander marched, the more foreign the world became. But he adapted. He met each new people with a blend of force and diplomacy. He allowed local customs, honored native temples. In return, he demanded loyalty, taxes, soldiers, silence. In Phrygia, he came to the city of Gordium, home of the legendary Gordian knot. It was said that whoever unraveled it would rule Asia. Alexander walked up to the knot, studied it for a moment, and sliced through it with his sword. A gesture, perhaps. But gestures have power. From there, his march continued. Through Cilicia, across mountain passes, along dusty roads where no king had walked in centuries, his army grew leaner, harder. They fought skirmishes. They endured heat, disease, exhaustion. But they followed because their leader did not ask of them anything he did not endure himself. Alexander slept on the ground, ate the same food, rode at the front, and spoke to his men not as a distant god, but as a brother in arms. By the time he reached the gates of Syria, the army was no longer just Macedonian, it was a machine, fueled by belief, bonded by blood, and led by a man who had never lost. The east-door march eastward had begun, and nothing, it seemed, could stand in its way. Chapter 7. Gordian knots and burning cities. The road east is long, but some moments on that path carry the weight of centuries. In the quiet city of Gordium, nestled in the heart of Phrygia, one such moment waited, hidden not behind a fortress or an army, but inside an ancient legend wrapped in rope. Alexander's army arrived in Gordium during the slow bloom of spring. The city, though modest in size, held a place of unusual importance in the story of the world. For centuries, it had been the spiritual heart of the Phrygian kings. Its myths were old, tangled like the knot that rested at its center, an object no one had untied, and many had tried. The knot was no ordinary puzzle. Thick ropes of cornel bark, twisted and looped upon themselves, bound the yoke of an old ox cart to its wooden shaft. No beginning, no end, a tangle of time. An oracle had long ago spoken. He who unravels the Gordian knot shall rule all of Asia. Warriors, priests, kings, they had all stood before it. All had failed. And now Alexander stood in that same spot, young, radiant, silent. He examined the knot not like a philosopher, but like a general, not looking for secrets, but for victory. And then, in a moment that would ripple through history like the ring of a sword against stone, he drew his blade and cut straight through it. There was no ceremony, no spell, just a single act, clean, final, defiant. Some say he cheated the prophecy, others say he fulfilled it. But to his men, to the locals, to the stories that would echo for centuries, it did not matter. The knot was no longer a barrier, it was a beginning. With one stroke, Alexander declared that he would not wait for fate. He would carve it, and Asia, it seemed, had heard him. Siege of Halicarnassus victory does not always come with a single sword stroke. Sometimes it must be earned, hour by hour, stone by stone, flame by flame. After Gordium, Alexander pushed south, toward the coast. There, perched above the Aegean Sea, lay the great city of Halicarnassus, a jewel of Persian rule, rich with marble and memory, protected by thick walls and defended by one of Persia's best commanders, Memnon of Rhodes. This would not be a battle of cavalry charges or open fields. It would be a siege, a grinding test of patience, engineering, and will. Alexander's army encircled the city like a tightening ring. Towers were built, battering rams rolled forward, catapults flung stones and fire against the high, defiant walls. Day after day, the Macedonians chipped away. Inside, Memnon fought back with equal brilliance. He launched sorties, set traps, used the very streets as weapons. His defenders poured oil and arrows from the ramparts. They collapsed buildings to block Macedonian advances. At night, the sky glowed with the eerie shimmer of distant flames as both sides tried to break the other's spirit. But Alexander did not yield, even when parts of the city burned, even when the battle seemed endless. He pressed on. Then came the turning point. A section of the wall was breached. Macedonian soldiers poured in. Chaos erupted. Fighting spilled from alleyways into the heart of Halicarnassus. Memnon, sensing defeat, ordered a retreat, but not before setting fire to what he could not save. Temples, homes, marketplaces, the city lit up like a funeral pyre. Smoke curled into the sky like a dying prayer. When the flames faded, Alexander stood in the ashes. He had won, but the Cost was visible in every blackened stone. The siege of Halicarnassus was not glorious. It was not clean, but it was necessary. It proved that Alexander could outlast as well as outfight, that he could break walls, not just armies. And beyond that, he had taken one of Persia's strongest coastal fortresses. The empire had lost more than a city. It had lost one of its shields, the flaming city of Sardis. If Halicarnassus was a battle of force, Sardis was a surrender to inevitability. The capital of ancient Lydia, Sardis sat at the edge of the Anatolian heartland. It was a city of golden grandeur, of legend and luxury. Once the seat of the fabulously wealthy King Croesus, it had long since fallen into Persian hands, but its soul remained proudly Greek. When Alexander approached, the city's garrison prepared for resistance. But the citizens, caught between loyalty and fear, hesitated. They had heard of Granicus. They had heard of Gordium, of Halicarnassus, and they had begun to whisper, not of Persian strength, but of Macedonian destiny. As Alexander's forces neared, the city opened its gates. There was no battle, there was no need. But what happened next marked a turning point, not in war, but in perception. As part of his entrance, Alexander climbed the Acropolis of Sardis, the steep citadel that overlooked the city. There, he made sacrifices to local gods, walked among ancient stones, and declared that Sardis would be free. Its laws restored, its temples honored, Persian officials replaced. To many, it felt like deliverance, but the symbolic power of that moment echoed farther than the city walls, because Alexander did not merely conquer Sardis, he absorbed it. He allowed its people to worship. He respected its past. And yet, he made it clear. They now belonged to something greater, something moving, rising, expanding like the tide, but not all welcomed him. Some loyalist factions resisted. Small fires were lit, acts of defiance in dark corners. Alexander responded swiftly. The fires were put out, rebels captured, punishments dealt. The flames that had marked past battles now flickered in the night sky, not as symbols of loss, but as quiet reminders. Resistance would not survive. The fall of Sardis was more than a city surrendering. It was a moment when people began to believe, not in Macedonian steel, but in the inevitability of Alexander myth and morale. By now, the man marching through Asia was no longer just a king. He was a story. Among his soldiers, whispers grew louder. They spoke not only of his victories, but of his visions. His connection to the gods, his unmatched courage, his refusal to lose, to fall ill, to retreat. Some said the sun followed him, others claimed he could not be killed. These stories did not come from scribes. They came from men who had fought beside him, who had seen him charge into battle first, bleeding, laughing, surviving when no one else could. They remembered how he had crossed the Granicus head-on, how he had cut the Gordian knot, how he had scaled city walls himself. He was not a figure behind the lines. He was in the storm every time. And slowly, something strange began to happen. Belief, the kind of belief that armies do not usually have. Not just in victory, but in the idea that they were part of something divine, that they were writing a story with their blades, that their king was not merely human, but chosen. Alexander encouraged this, subtly, strategically. He invoked Heracles, Achilles. He told stories of omens, dreams, signs. He treated temples with reverence, honored gods both Greek and foreign, and he wore symbols, cloaks, jewelry, armor that shimmered with the aura of myth. But behind the sacred gestures was something deeply practical: morale. An army that believes is an army that endures. Through deserts, through sickness, through siege, by inspiring his men with symbols larger than life, Alexander ensured their loyalty not only to him, but to the mission itself. They did not fight for land anymore, they fought for legacy, and in their hearts they were already marching through history. Chapter 8. The King of Two Worlds. Battle of Issus. For months, Alexander had marched eastward. Cities had fallen, rivers had been crossed, walls had crumbled beneath his will. And through it all, the one name that had remained just beyond, reach, like a shadow behind silk, was Darius. Darius III, King of Kings, the ruler of the vast Persian Empire, the descendant of Cyrus the Great. He was the man Alexander had come to face, and until now he had remained absent, distant, watching, preparing, but no longer. In the fall of 333 BCE, the silence broke. Word spread through campfires and market stalls, through whispers among officers and chants among Persian loyalists. Darius was coming. He did not arrive quietly. The Persian king marched with an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands, a sea of soldiers that stretched across the earth like a living tide. Archers, cavalry, spearmen, chariots with blades mounted on their wheels. And at the center of this storm, under a golden canopy, rode Darius himself, clothed in silks, armored in polished bronze, attended by eunuchs, generals, and the symbols of empire. He carried not just the weight of an army, but the expectation of an ancient realm. To his people, he was divine, chosen, the light of the East. To Alexander's men, he was a final test, a mountain they had trained their whole lives to climb. Darius had come not only to fight, but to erase the insult of Granicus, to remind the world that Persia was not dying, that it would not kneel. To a boy from the north, and yet, even as he rode forward with all the ceremony of royalty, there was unease. The lands around him were foreign, the people hesitant. The speed and precision of the Macedonians had unnerved his court. Still he believed in his numbers, in his name, in the legacy of kings. He had not yet seen what belief could do when shaped into a spear. The narrow plain of battle. The field of Issus was not wide. Nestled between the sea and a ridge of mountains, it was narrow, cramped, almost like a funnel. Not the place one would choose to unleash the might of the Persian host. But war does not always obey the wishes of kings. When Alexander learned that Darius had crossed behind him, cutting off his supply lines, threatening his wounded, he did not hesitate. He turned his army, marched through the night, and positioned them on the same plain the next morning before Darius could dig his heels too deep. And so, beneath a dull sky and beside the chilly waters of the Pinarus River, the stage was set. Darius aligned his forces with confidence. His front stretched wide, infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, archers in layered ranks. And at the rear, his royal guard and chariots waiting to strike. The Persians had numbers, they had terrain to their back, and they had the moral high ground. This was their empire after all, but Alexander had something else. He had discipline and momentum. The Macedonian army formed in its familiar pattern, the phalanx in the center, shields locked, sarissas raised like a field of iron. Reads, cavalry on the flanks, agile, alert. And Alexander himself positioned on the right, near the coast. The young king watched the river, listened to the wind. Then he gave the signal. The army surged forward. The phalanx hit the river first, clashing, with the Persian center in a deafening roar of metal and flesh. On the flanks, cavalry collided, hooves slipping in the mud, riders slashing through chaos. The river itself, once a boundary, now boiled with blood. Alexander did not sit back. He rode with his men, spear in hand, eyes fixed on a single point, Darius. The narrowness of the field made the Persian numbers almost useless. Their rear ranks couldn't move, their chariots couldn't charge. The noise of battle trapped them like thunder inside a cave. It wasn't long before the line began to crack, and where the crack appeared, the Macedonian hammer fell. Darius flees in the haze of screams and smoke. One moment changed everything. Darius, perched on a golden chariot surrounded by guards, watched as his right flank crumbled. His elite troops meant to shield him were being pushed back. Alexander, relentless, had spotted the opening and now surged toward the Persian center with terrifying focus. For a heartbeat, the King of Kings hesitated. Perhaps he believed he could turn the tide. Perhaps he hoped the cavalry would rally. But hope, like mist, vanishes in sunlight. And the sun that day was carried on a Macedonian spear. The cry went out, the king is threatened. And then, the unthinkable. Darius turned. He abandoned his chariot, mounted a horse, and fled. The most powerful man in Asia ran. To the soldiers who saw him retreat, it was like the sky cracking. Order dissolved, morale shattered. Men who had marched proudly now turned in panic. Some tried to fight on, others dropped their weapons. But the tide had turned, and no command could stop it. Alexander pursued, briefly. But the king slipped away, protected by the chaos he left behind. When the dust settled, the field of Issus lay heavy with bodies. The Persian army had not just lost, it had broken. The Macedonian camp erupted in quiet awe. They had not just defeated an army, they had unmade an empire's illusion. Alexander had faced the great Darius, and Darius had fled. And in that flight, something greater than a battle had been won. In the minds of his men, and in the eyes of the world, Alexander was no longer simply a king. He was becoming a legend. The spoils of victory, the silence after battle often says more than the clash itself, as the last Persian archers dropped their bows, as wounded men cried out in fading voices. Alexander walked among the spoils of war, not with celebration, but with clarity. What Issus had given him was more than territory. It was treasure, influence, and power that pulsed like fire beneath the skin of an ancient empire. The Persian royal tent was taken intact. Inside, silks hung from the walls. Gold littered the ground. Exotic scents still lingered in the air. The royal standard of Darius lay crumpled beside a throne that had never been used, but greater than gold were the prisoners. Among them, the family of Darius himself, his wife, his daughters, his mother, women of immense status, draped in sorrow and fear. They had not fought. But now they were trophies, living reminders of a fleeing king. Alexander did not harm them. Instead, he treated them with honor. He offered them their dignity. A gesture not only of character, but of strategy. Mercy, too, can be a weapon. News of Darius's flight spread quickly across Asia Minor, across Greece, across the known world. Cities that had once stood neutral began to reconsider. Those that feared Persia began to lean toward Alexander. Alliances shifted, gates opened without battle. Victory had become a current, and it was flowing east. Yet Alexander did not rest. He wrote letters, issued commands, rewarded his men. He knew that the war was not over, that Darius would return, that greater battles still lay ahead. But in this moment, under the quiet sky of a conquered field, something had changed forever. He was no longer the invader. He was the king of two worlds, European and Asian, warrior and ruler, mortal and myth. And the road ahead stretched wide, paved in both shadows and starlight. Chapter 9. The Siege of Tyre. Far to the south of Issus, where the sea lapped quietly against the Levantine coast, there stood a city unlike any other in Alexander's long campaign, a place of stone and sea, commerce and stubbornness. A city that clung to the water like a jewel to a crown. Tyre. Once a Phoenician stronghold, Tyre had grown over centuries into a place of prestige and pride. Traders from every corner of the Mediterranean docked at its harbours. Its walls were high, its towers confident, and most striking of all, the city stood not on the mainland, but on an island. Surrounded on all sides by the blue embrace of the sea, Tyre seemed untouchable. Its people believed they were safe, not because they could fight harder, but because nature had placed them beyond the reach of armies. They had seen conquerors come and go. Even the mighty Assyrians had once tried and failed to bring them to their knees. So when Alexander sent envoys to demand entry, to sacrifice at their temple, to symbolically take the city, the Tyrians refused, not with war, cries, not with arrows, with silence, and then with defiance. They killed his messengers and threw their bodies from the walls into the sea. This was no longer a political standoff, it was a challenge, a test, a provocation sent directly to a king who had never accepted the word no. But Tyre was different. Tyre was not a field or a valley or a city of open gates. It was surrounded by water. No bridge, no road, no weakness. To attack it meant to defy geography itself. Still, Alexander did not turn back. He stood on the shore, looked out at the distant walls, and said, "If the sea keeps me from the city, I will bring the land to the sea." The siege of Tyre had begun. Building a causeway of bones, the first challenge was simple but impossible. Tyre lay a full half-mile off the coast. That stretch of sea, though calm, was deep and shifting. No siege towers could roll across it. No phalanx could march upon waves. But Alexander was not deterred. He would not wait for Tyre to surrender. He would build his own path to the city. The engineers were summoned, orders were issued, trees were felled, rocks were hauled, and the army began its most ambitious construction, a massive stone causeway stretching from the mainland out toward the island. At first, it looked foolish, a pile of dirt against a fortress. But day by day, the mole, as it came to be called, grew. Stones were laid in the water, forming the foundation. Earth was piled on top. Wooden planks provided support. Towering siege engines were wheeled forward as progress was made. But the Tyrians were watching. From their walls and warships they saw the causeway inch closer, and they responded with everything they had. Boats attacked the construction at night, lighting fires and scattering crews. Archers rained arrows onto workers. Divers swam beneath the water, pulling loose the foundations. It was not war in the traditional sense. It was erosion, sabotage, attrition, and yet the work continued, day after day, week after week. As the causeway moved closer, Tyre grew desperate. They loaded a massive ship with dry twigs, pitch and sulfur, a floating bomb. They set it alight and sent it straight at the causeway. The explosion was immense. Flames tore through engines. Crews fled. Weeks of labor vanished in hours, but Alexander simply rebuilt. This time with better defenses. Towers lined the causeway. Archers protected the builders. Iron plates shielded engines from fire. Slowly, the mole crept forward again. Every stone in that half-mile bridge was paid for in sweat, blood, or bone. But inch by inch, the sea gave way to land. 7 months of fire, Tyre did not fall quickly. For 7 long months, the siege wore on, a battle not just of strength, but of spirit. The closer the causeway drew, the more intense the struggle became. Alexander's army faced everything: scorching sun, constant sabotage, the ever-present threat of naval attack. Yet they did not stop. Tyre's defences were formidable. Its walls, rising straight from the sea, stood over 150 feet high. Its fleet was vast, agile, and strategically superior. The Tyrians had allies, ships from Carthage, from Cyprus, from neighbouring Phoenician ports. They used them well. But Alexander had an answer for that too. He summoned his own navy, over 200 ships from conquered coastal cities. Greek vessels. Phoenician ships that had once served Persia. Slowly, he built a blockade. The island's lifelines began to close, and then the final phase began. Siege towers, monstrous machines bristling with catapults, rolled along the completed causeway. Battering rams pounded the seaward gates. Fire arrows lit the sky. Underwater divers cut through harbour chains. Walls were weakened. Cracks appeared. The Macedonians launched a full-scale assault. They came in from both land and sea, ramming the walls with ships, scaling them with ladders. Archers provided cover. Engineers threw oil and flame. Soldiers climbed under hailstorms of stones and javelins. It was chaos for days. The battle swirled at the water's edge, foaming with blood. Hundreds died on both sides. But Alexander, relentless as ever, pushed forward. He led from the front. He shouted from the waves. And finally, a breach. Macedonian soldiers poured into the city. What followed was brutal. The months of resistance, the death of envoys, the sheer cost of the siege, all came crashing down in a storm of vengeance. Streets ran red. Fires consumed palaces. Thousands were slaughtered. Others were chained, marched into slavery. The sea that once protected Tyre now reflected only smoke and silence. A message to the world. When the fires burned low and the dead were buried beneath rubble, Alexander stood where kings had once walked and sent a message, not in words, but in ash. Tyre had fallen, not to negotiation, not to surrender, but to absolute force. News of the siege travelled fast. To cities that had once considered rebellion, the lesson was clear. No fortress was safe, no island unreachable, no wall too high. To the Persian court, still reeling from Issus, it was another shock. The young Macedonian, whom they had once dismissed as impulsive and arrogant, had now shown patience, engineering, strategy. He had outlasted a city that had defied empires for centuries, and to Alexander's men, the siege was a turning point. They had seen their king not just as a warrior, but as a builder, a leader who never asked more of them than he gave. They believed more deeply than ever, not just in victory, but in something greater, that they were not merely marching through land, but through history. Tyre, once proud and distant, had become a symbol of Alexander's will, a warning to those who stood against him, and a prophecy of what lay ahead, because if a city in the sea could fall, then perhaps even the heart of the Persian Empire would soon open. Chapter 10. Egypt bows to the son of Amun. The Nile flowed like a sleeping god, ancient, slow, eternal. Along its banks time seemed to move differently. Here, where sand met river, the air was softer. The wars of Persia, the burning of Tyre, the march of armies, all of it felt distant now. When Alexander arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE, the land did not resist him. No battles greeted his entry, no walls stood in defiance. Instead, Egypt opened like a scroll, its people weary of Persian rule and eager for something new. The satrap Mazaces, understanding the futility of resistance, surrendered without bloodshed. The land embraced him, and in return, Alexander offered something bold, something lasting. He travelled to the northern coast where the Nile met the Mediterranean in a broad sweeping delta. There, among fishermen's huts and shifting sandbars, he saw something others did not. He saw vision. He saw future. He saw a city. It would not be built with haste, not with simple glory. It would be a city of light, of knowledge, of bridges between worlds, Greek and Egyptian, East and West, science and myth. He laid its plans with careful thought, placing its streets in grids, carving harbours for trade, building walls that would one day hold scrolls, scholars, and secrets. The city would be called Alexandria. It would outlive him. It would outlive kingdoms. Alexander did not linger long there. The world still waited to be claimed, but with his footsteps the foundations were set, and with each stone that followed, a myth grew. That of a conqueror who was also a creator. Alexandria was not just a city, it was a promise to the oracle of Siwa. Not long after, Alexander turned inland, not for conquest, but for answers. He crossed the Nile and entered the desert. Not just any desert, but the deep, golden silence of the western sands, the kind of place where time folds inward and the sun seems to speak. For days, his small company marched across scorched stone and wind-whipped dunes, guided only by stars and the wisdom of desert men. Their destination was Siwa, a sacred oasis hidden far from the coast, where an oracle of Amun whispered truths said to come from gods themselves. Why did he go? Some say it was curiosity, others say ambition. But perhaps it was need. For Alexander, whose mother had told him since childhood that he was not just mortal, that Zeus had fathered him in a blaze of divine breath, this journey was not toward myth. It was toward confirmation. The way was brutal. Sandstorms swallowed the horizon, water ran low. At times, the sun blurred the edge between real and unreal. One tale says the army lost its way, and that two snakes appeared, guiding them to safety. Another says a sudden rain fell, soft and rare, just when thirst had nearly claimed them. Whatever truth lies in those stories, they reached Siwa. The temple was ancient, nestled in palms, its stones worn smooth by time. Alexander entered alone. No generals, no scribes, no soldiers, only silence, and when he emerged, he said little, only that the oracle had spoken. Later, his companions would claim he was told what he had always suspected, that he was not merely king of men, but son of a god. The oracle had called him son of Amun. And that name, whispered in the desert, would echo through marble halls and battlefield dust for centuries to come. Crowned by the sun, if Persia had looked on Alexander with suspicion, Egypt looked upon him with awe. Their pharaohs had long been seen not only as rulers, but as divine intermediaries, chosen by the gods, crowned beneath the gaze of the sun itself. And so when Alexander entered Memphis, the traditional capital of Lower Egypt, the people saw not an invader, but a fulfillment. He made offerings to Apis, the sacred bull. He wore Egyptian robes, honored their gods, and stood not above them, but among them. His actions were not those of conquerors past. He did not impose foreign worship. He embraced the land's ancient spirit. The priests, cautious at first, watched closely, and slowly, reverently, they placed upon his head the symbols of the pharaohs, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the uraeus, the serpent of royalty. The cartouche bearing his name in hieroglyphs. Alexander was now Pharaoh of Egypt, but more than a title, it was a transformation. In that moment, his identity expanded, no longer just son of Philip, no longer just king of Macedonia or leader of Greeks. He was divine to one world, royal to another, a bridge between heaven and earth. His image would be carved on temple walls, his name spoken in rituals, his presence felt in the slow, sacred rhythm of the Nile. To the Egyptians, this was not politics, it was cosmology. Balance restored, order returned. And to Alexander, it was something deeper. It was affirmation that the path he walked was not merely his own, but written in the stars. The calm before Gaugamela, the desert wind, quieted. The streets of Memphis grew still. And for the first time in years, Alexander rested. It was a brief calm. But in its stillness, something rare unfolded. Reflection. In Egypt, there were no marching armies, no urgent dispatches, no sieges or storms. The land, ancient and wise, offered him a different kind of power, not through conquest, but through harmony. He visited temples, consulted astrologers, walked beside the Nile at dusk where ibis birds drifted through reeds and the water shimmered gold. His men feasted, his generals planned. And all the while a shadow loomed to the northeast, Darius. The Persian king had not disappeared. After Issus, he had fled into the heart of his empire, regrouping, rebuilding. And now word came that he was raising a new army, vast, final. Alexander knew the moment was coming, but he did not rush. Instead, he allowed the calm to strengthen him. Egypt was secure. The gods had spoken. The people had welcomed him. His title was no longer simply earned, it was believed. In that rare pause, he became more than strategist or soldier. He became myth. The sun touched his crown, the desert breathed around him, and somewhere in the east, the sands of Gaugamela waited. Chapter 11. Gaugamela. The world surrenders. The desert wind moved softly over the land, brushing past rocks and hills that had seen thousands of sunrises but never a day like the one that was coming. Beneath the star-strewn sky, two armies prepared to collide. And in that stillness, before the fire, before the fury, there was only silence, the silence of fate drawing near. After Egypt, Alexander's march turned east once more. The Nile, calm and sacred, had given him peace. But destiny waited in the open plains of Mesopotamia, and so he left the comfort of temples and prophecy behind and returned to the march. By late September of 331 BCE, his army had reached the Tigris River. They crossed it slowly, methodically, their sandals brushing silt, their minds sharp with anticipation. Word had arrived days earlier. Darius was coming. Again. But this time, not as a desperate king on the run. This time, he brought the full weight of the Persian Empire. The plains of Gaugamela had been chosen by Darius himself. He had cleared the land to give his enormous army every possible advantage. Tens of thousands of infantry, thousands more cavalry, hundreds of war chariots equipped with scythed wheels meant to cut through flesh and formation. Even elephants, terrifying and unfamiliar to the Greeks, stood ready to trample and roar. Darius had not come to repel Alexander, he had come to end him. And yet Alexander didn't flinch. His men, hardened by years of war, battle-tested from Granicus to Tyre, trusted him completely. They had followed him through valleys and storms, through blood and flame. Now they stood again on the edge of something final. Omens were read, sacrifices made, dreams shared. One tale says Alexander dreamt of a satyr dancing, and his soothsayer interpreted it as a sign that the land would surrender to him. Across the field, Darius too sought omens. His astrologers studied the skies and declared the gods were watching. The night glowed faintly with torchlight on both sides. Thousands of flickering stars above and thousands of smaller stars below, burning in the hands of men who might not live to see dawn. They did not speak it aloud, but both armies knew. Tomorrow, the world would change, the immortal battle. Morning came slowly. The sun rose like a golden coin over the horizon, casting long shadows over the broad plain of Gaugamela. And then it began. The Persian army, stretched across the field like a glittering wave, advanced first. Darius sat at the center in a tall chariot surrounded by elite guards, watching the battlefield as one might watch a storm gathering from a mountain top. His lines were vast, well-positioned, and far larger than Alexander's, But Alexander had no intention of meeting strength with strength. His strategy was precise, built not on numbers, but on movement. He deployed his phalanx in the center, rows of disciplined soldiers armed with long sarissas that bristled like thorns against the horizon. His cavalry, led by trusted generals like Parmenion and himself, held the flanks. The battlefield was flat, exposed, and immense. The opening was cautious. Then chaos unfolded. Darius unleashed his chariots. They roared across the field, their blades spinning, their horses foaming. But Alexander was ready. As they approached, his soldiers stepped aside in practiced unison, opening lanes between their ranks where the chariots passed uselessly, only to be swarmed and pulled down from behind. Next came the cavalry clashes. Thousands of horses smashed together, riders screaming, swords ringing. Clouds of dust rose so thick they swallowed the sun. In the center, the Macedonian phalanx held firm, inching forward with terrifying precision. Then Alexander made his move. He noticed a small gap, a break in the Persian line near Darius. He gathered his companion cavalry and, without hesitation, charged straight through it. The world narrowed to the sound of hoofbeats and steel. Alexander's helmet glinted. His cloak whipped behind him. Around him, his men cut down the guards of Darius one by one. They could see the king now, standing tall in his chariot, eyes wide. But just as at Issus, Darius chose flight. He leapt from his chariot and fled once more, his second and final escape from the battlefield. The Persian line wavered, then broke, all. Across the field, the sound of collapse filled the air. Armor dropping, banners falling, screams of retreat swallowed by the dust. Macedonian forces pressed the advantage. Parmenion, pinned on the left flank for hours, now surged forward, joining the final sweep of victory. By sunset, the plain was quiet. Gaugamela had ended, and the earth would never be the same. Darius defeated. Again, night returned, but it did not bring peace to the Persian world. Darius, once again humiliated, fled east, deeper into the lands that had once trembled beneath his authority. His golden canopy, his royal guards, his war elephants, all had failed. And this time there would be no second recovery, no armies left to summon, no alliances left to forge. The Persian Empire had not merely lost a battle. It had been dismantled. Alexander, on the other hand, did not pursue blindly. He allowed his men to rest, to count the dead, to honor the fallen. Nearly all the Persian generals were killed. Tens of thousands lay lifeless in the dust. But this victory was more than a military triumph. It was a symbolic death of the old world. Darius still lived, but his image had vanished. His name no longer inspired loyalty, only pity or betrayal. His own nobles would soon abandon him, seeking favor with the new master of the East. For years, the great king had ruled a realm stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. Now, that title belonged to someone else, Alexander. The boy from Macedonia who had once looked upon the Aegean as the edge of the known world had now crossed through history, not merely as a conqueror, but as the man who ended an empire, and still, he did not stop. He would chase Darius across mountains. He would press deeper into the east, but at Gaugamela, he had already won something more powerful than territory. He had taken the idea of Persia and made it his own, the king of Asia. In the quiet days that followed the battle, Alexander stood atop a ridge and looked out at the land he had taken. This was no longer a campaign, it was a coronation. The capitals of the Persian Empire, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, lay ahead, trembling. Messengers from every corner of the empire were already arriving, offering tokens of submission. Cities that had once shut their gates now prepared feasts. Former enemies bowed, and everywhere his army marched, the people no longer asked who he was. They asked where he would go next. In Babylon, the streets were laid with flowers for his arrival. Priests greeted him with open arms. Gold and treasures, art and horses, scholars and dancers, all were offered in tribute. In the great halls of Susa, Alexander found the riches of centuries. In Persepolis, he stood among the palaces of kings and chose what to preserve and what to burn, but power did not change him. It expanded him. He kept his soldiers close, honored their sacrifices, rewarded the wounded, and yet something inside him had begun to shift. He was no longer a Macedonian king commanding foreign lands. He had become something larger, a symbol, a figure not bound to any one place. He began to dress in Persian robes, sat upon thrones once, reserved for the god-kings of the East, issued decrees in multiple languages, honored foreign gods, not to flatter, but to unite. Because now he was not just the king of Macedonia, he was king of Asia, the ruler of a world that for the first time was beginning to feel whole. Chapter 12. The March to the Edge of the Earth. After Gaugamela, after the fall of Darius, after the doors of the Persian Empire were thrown open, most would have stopped. Most kings would have rested in opulence, content with palaces, titles, and tribute. But Alexander was not most kings. He turned his gaze east, and what lay ahead was not empire, but endurance. The road led him toward Bactria, a land not of luxury, but of resistance. Bactria was no golden throne room. It was wind-scoured cliffs and snow-draped ranges where mountains rose like frozen waves and valleys hid rebels in their folds. The people there did not bow easily. They had no taste for kings, no love for conquerors. They vanished into caves. They struck by night. They fought not to win, but never to yield. Alexander marched anyway. The army followed him into terrain that broke the body and tested the will. Across the Hindu Kush they climbed, where the thin air tore at their lungs and snow fell even in spring. Food was scarce, shelters were few. Horses died on narrow passes, men slipped on ice and were never found. Still they pressed on. Alexander adopted new tactics. He divided his forces, sent out swift detachments to hunt rebels through the hills. Fortresses were taken stone by stone. Villages were spared or burned, depending on the flags they flew. Every day brought a new ambush. Every morning another stretch of rock to climb. This was not glory. It was attrition. But through it all, he did not falter. His cloak grew heavier with snow, his face sharpened by cold. But his resolve only deepened, because in this wilderness, something shifted. The campaign was no longer about Persia, it was about the edge of the world, love and conquest, In the midst of cold valleys and burning resistance, something unexpected bloomed. In the fortress of Sogdian rock, a near impossible citadel perched atop a cliff. Alexander faced one of his hardest challenges yet. The local warlord believed it to be untakeable. Soaring above the plain with sheer sides and only a narrow path leading to its gates, the stronghold mocked every assault. But Alexander didn't retreat. He asked for volunteers, climbers, brave, and mad enough to scale the vertical cliffs by night. Using tent ropes, pitons, and sheer courage, a small team ascended the impossible. By morning, they appeared on the upper slopes, where no army should ever be. The defenders surrendered in shock. Among the captured nobles was a young woman named Roxana. Her name meant Little Star, and to Alexander she seemed to shine through the dust and strangeness of the East. She was not just beautiful, she was noble, proud, intelligent, and more than that, she was Bactrian. In marrying her, Alexander did something profound. It was not only love, it was strategy, a gesture to the land he sought to rule. He was not just a conqueror. He would become part of the place, not through decree, but through blood. The marriage was celebrated in both Macedonian and local custom. His men watched, half curious, half skeptical. They wondered if their king, who had once spoken of glory and Greece, was now losing himself to the east. But Alexander saw no contradiction. To him, love and conquest were not opposites. They were two ways of binding the world, and Roxana would ride with him further still, through forests, across rivers, toward lands that no Greek had ever seen. Founding new cities. As the army moved ever eastward, something remarkable happened in its wake. Cities began to rise, not merely conquered ones, but new ones. Places that had never existed, now etched into the earth by Alexander's hand. Settlements with walls and grids, markets and wells, streets lined with Greek stonework, central plazas where locals and soldiers mingled, each one born from nothing. But map and vision, they were called Alexandrias, not one, not two, but dozens, scattered across Asia like seeds in the wind. Each Alexandria served a purpose. Some were military outposts, strongholds to keep the peace. Others were trade hubs, connecting distant cultures. Still others became melting pots, where Greek and local languages blended, where temples to Zeus stood beside Eastern shrines. To the ancient world, cities were more than buildings. They were statements, symbols of order, of permanence, of thought. And Alexander, ever aware of legacy, built with that in mind. He wasn't just marching toward the unknown, he was shaping it. With each city, he left behind a piece of his dream, a fragment of his presence that would last longer than any empire. His soldiers married local women, his officers governed provinces, his laws were written in two tongues, his vision stretched beyond war, towards civilization. The land behind him wasn't conquered, it was transformed, and even as his shadow fell upon distant lands, new Alexandria stood in the sun. The dream of India. But even as cities rose, as marriages were made, as mountain passes were crossed, Alexander's gaze remained fixed on something further still. India, to the Greeks, it was a land of mystery and myth, a place beyond the edges of the map. Home to strange beasts, endless rivers, golden temples, and wisdom whispered by stars. It was not just another region. It was the edge of the world, and Alexander could not resist the pull. He questioned sages, asked travelers, consulted priests and astronomers. Every story he heard only deepened his obsession. He was told that beyond the great river, the Indus, lay a people untouched by war. That to reach the ocean beyond India was to reach the end of the earth. He believed it, not as a soldier, but as a seeker. So in 327 BCE, he began his push into India. He was warned that it was vast, that its kings were powerful, that his men were weary, but none of it mattered. His army crossed the Hindu Kush once more, this time southward into Punjab. The land changed again, greener, wetter, rivers surged, elephants thundered. Fortresses were carved into cliffs, kingdoms rose and fell like clouds. Here, Alexander met new enemies and new allies. He fought Porus, the proud king who rode a war elephant taller than any beast the Macedonians had ever seen. The battle was fierce in rain and mud, with men slipping and dying under foreign skies. But Alexander won, and after the battle, when Porus stood before him, wounded, unbowed, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. "As a king," Porus answered. Alexander smiled. He gave him his kingdom back, and more. But even after this victory, Alexander's dream was not yet fulfilled. He wanted to go further, to the Ganges, to the ocean beyond, but his men, tired, hearts stretched thin, bones aching with years of marching, refused. They begged, then demanded, and finally, Alexander listened. He turned back, not as a man defeated, but as one who had touched the edge and left a mark where the map ended. Chapter 13. Into the heart of India. The river moved like a living thread of time, silent, wide, unknowable. The Indus. To Alexander, it was no longer just a name in books or whispers carried by travelers. It was now real, stretching before him like a gate into myth. This was not merely a body of water. It was a boundary between all that had been conquered and all that remained unknown. Behind him lay Babylon and Persepolis, the broken crown of Darius, and the echoes of Gaugamela. Before him lay a land that no Greek king had dared enter. India, a place of ancient wisdom, strange beasts and kingdoms whose armies were still untested by Macedonian steel. The Indus was swollen with the early rains. Its current, dark and curling, whispered warnings in every ripple. The far bank was shrouded in morning mist, the jungle beyond breathing with the heat of life. It was a land of other rhythms, colors deeper, air thicker, songs stranger. Alexander did not hesitate. He ordered boats to be built from local timber, rafts, pontoons, ferries, each one tied with rope and faith. He sent scouts ahead to find crossings and met with local chieftains who watched him with guarded curiosity. When the vessels were ready, the army began its slow passage, horse after horse, soldier after soldier, slipping over the water in silence. No drums, no horns, just oars creaking and eyes fixed on the mist ahead. As they landed on Indian soil, the men disembarked into a world transformed. The terrain was green and vibrant. Birds screeched from the trees in calls they had never heard before. Monkeys chattered overhead. The people wore light robes, spoke unfamiliar languages, and worshipped gods carved from stone with faces serene and terrifying. Alexander approached them not with fire, but with wonder. He offered respect to their customs, visited temples, and invited their sages to speak. He wanted not only to conquer the land, but to understand it, to draw its soul into his own. But the land would not yield so easily. The Battle of the Hydaspes. Not far beyond the Indus stood another river, the Hydaspes, and there, waiting on its far bank, was a king, Porus. His name echoed like a challenge. A tall, proud monarch of the Paurava kingdom, Porus was no minor chieftain. He was a warrior. His people respected him. His soldiers followed with loyalty, not fear. And most formidable of all, he had elephants. Alexander had heard of them before. Tales of thunderous beasts with steel-tipped tusks, thick skin like armor, and the power to crush men beneath their feet. But until now those were only stories. Now he could hear their growls, see their silhouettes on the far shore. The Hydaspes was flooded, rushing, foaming, wild from weeks of rain. A direct assault would be suicide. But Alexander, ever the tactician, waited. He studied the shoreline, waited for a storm. Then, under the cover of night and lightning, he led a small force northward, crossing the river in secret. When Porus realized what had happened, it was too late. The battle began in a haze of water, wind, and mud. War elephants charged, their trunks raised, their tusks gleaming. Macedonian horses reared, panicked by the scent and sight. Infantry lines splintered. Archers loosed volleys that vanished into the rain. The river became a battlefield, its banks churned into mud, its shallows red with blood. Alexander attacked with precision. He circled Porus's army, struck from the rear, and sent phalanxes forward to pin the elephants. Spears jabbed, men screamed. Some elephants trampled their own allies, blinded by wounds and fire. Porus fought at the center of it all, mounted on his elephant, tall as a tower, hurling javelins into the chaos. Even as his army collapsed, he stood firm, bloodied, unbroken. When he was finally surrounded, captured, and brought before Alexander, the king asked what he wished of him. "Like a king," Porus replied. And so Alexander gave him his kingdom and more. But the price was great. Thousands of Macedonians lay dead. The army, once eager and invincible, now limped forward, hearts heavy, eyes weary. The battle of the Hydaspes had been won, but the dream was changing. The cost of glory. After Hydaspes, the march did not stop, but something inside the army did. The rains did not cease. Each day brought another downpour. Each road turned to river. The mud swallowed boots, and sometimes men. Disease crept in, the kind that could not be fought with swords. Mosquitoes sang their soft death songs. Water ran low, food spoiled fast. And still Alexander pressed east. They passed through jungles where the canopy blocked the sky, and every leaf dripped with moisture. Snakes coiled in silence. Wild dogs howled at night. The local tribes resisted fiercely, attacking with poisoned arrows and fading into the trees. Cities were taken. New Alexandrias were founded, but each one felt more like a monument to exhaustion than victory. The pace slowed, the camps grew quieter, laughter became rare. Some of the veterans, men who had fought at Issus, at Tyre, at Gaugamela, began to falter, not in their swords, but in their eyes. They had been away from home for nearly a decade. Their children had grown without them. Some had no family left at all. They still loved Alexander, still revered him. But the dream that had once united them was now stretched thin, like a bowstring ready to snap. Alexander seemed not to notice. He talked of the Ganges, of the great ocean beyond it, of new kingdoms, new stars to follow. But the men no longer looked east. They began to look behind them, toward the Tigris, the Euphrates, the plains of Macedonia, toward home. The army refuses. The river was called the Hyphasis. Beyond it lay yet more kingdoms, more rivers, and the promise of the end of the world. Alexander stood before his army, his cloak still soaked from the morning rains, his boots muddy from the banks. His face was calm, but his voice carried the thunder of kings. He spoke of vision, of legacy, of how history would remember this moment. He told them they were close. That glory waited just a little farther, that those who turned back now would be forgotten. But no one moved. For the first time in years, the Macedonian army did not march when he commanded. It stood still, quietly, respectfully, but unmoved. The officers came to him, one by one. They bowed, they pleaded, not for victory, not for loot, for rest. Alexander retreated into his tent. He did not eat. He did not sleep. Days passed. The camp grew quiet. And then, finally, he emerged. He called for a sacrifice. 12 great altars were built, dedicated to the gods who had guided them thus far. Each altar marked with the name of a battle, a river, a city. And then he turned west. The journey had ended, not in defeat, but in understanding. Even a god-king must listen to his people. Even Alexander must turn from the edge. And so, with hearts divided, they began the long march home. Chapter 14. The Long Return. The world had changed. Alexander had reached the edge, glimpsed the waters beyond India, and turned back. But the journey home would not be a return in the traditional sense. It would be a trial, a reckoning, a long unraveling of triumph, and it would begin in the dust. The Gedrosian desert stretched like a wound across the map, a wide, burning wasteland that bled into the Arabian Sea. It was a place feared by all, traveled by few. Even Cyrus the Great, centuries before, had lost an army trying to cross it. Alexander knew this, and still he chose it. Not by necessity, but by design. He wanted to mirror his fleet, which was sailing down the coast. He wanted to map the unknown, but deeper than that perhaps was something more personal. A need to test himself again, to meet the gods in a place where all comforts were stripped away. The crossing began in the heat of summer. The sun rose, each morning like a curse, merciless and brilliant, burning through every veil of cloud. Sandstorms came without warning, grinding the flesh from faces, ripping tents from the ground. Water was scarce, wells were dry or poisoned, camels collapsed in the heat. Men fell, lips cracked, skin blistered, and did not rise again. Food turned to ash in their mouths. Armor became too heavy to wear. Robes were soaked in sweat, then stiff with salt. The soldiers walked in silence, heads down, eyes half closed. Marching through mirages and memory, Alexander suffered with them. He refused shade when others had none. He walked beside the carts, not ahead of them. When a helmet full of water was brought to him, the last drops from a cracked jar, he poured it into the sand, refusing what his men could not share. They saw it, and in their suffering, they loved him more deeply, but the desert took its toll. Thousands died. Some disappeared in the night, lost to the dunes. Others went mad and had to be left behind. By the time they reached the coast, the army was a shadow of what it had been, not broken, but hollowed. The Gedrosian desert did not defeat Alexander, but it drained something from him, something that would not return. Homeward ghosts when the sands finally gave way to roads, and roads to familiar plains. The army moved with a haunted quiet. They had left as warriors. They returned as survivors. And as they approached Babylon, the jewel of the empire, the seat of gods and kings, the land seemed almost too soft beneath their feet. The palms rustled gently, the canals shimmered, music played from distant courtyards. It was spring again, but they had changed. Alexander entered the city not as a conqueror, but as something else, something older, wearier, more enigmatic. His face was sharper, his eyes darker. He wore Persian robes now, mingled. Customs spoke in many tongues. The boy from Pella was gone. In his place stood a king of the world, and yet, somehow, alone. He held court in Babylon's great palace, the same halls where Nebuchadnezzar had once walked. Marble floors, golden ceilings, fountains whispering in the heat. Ambassadors came from every corner of the known world: Arabia, Carthage, Ethiopia, India. But for every face that bowed before him, there were ghosts. He thought of Hephaestion, his closest friend, his brother in arms, his shadow. He had fallen ill months earlier and died in Ecbatana. Alexander had wept like a child. He had refused food, refused sleep. He had ordered temples closed in mourning and spent days beside the body, whispering words no one else could hear. Now, Babylon felt empty without him. Many of the old companions were gone, fallen in battle, claimed by disease, or left behind by time. The ones who remained looked at Alexander with different eyes: respect, fear, distance. He was no longer among them. He was above them, and perhaps even to himself. He was beyond reach, the empty throne. Though the empire stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, and Alexander's name was spoken in dozens of languages, something fragile stirred beneath the surface. The machine he had built, so precise, so unstoppable, had begun to crack. In Persia, Greek soldiers married local women. In Babylon, Macedonian officers dressed in Eastern silks, the lines between cultures blurred. For some, this was unity. For others, it was betrayal. Alexander tried to hold it all together. He held great feasts, staged mass weddings, appointed both Persians and Macedonians to high offices. He even declared himself a son of Zeus Ammon, divine not only by birth, but by right. Many were uneasy. Some whispered behind closed doors. Others voiced concerns openly. Were they still fighting for Macedonia, or for a god who wore too many crowns? The older generals, men who had marched with Philip, felt alienated. The younger ones, raised in war, worshipped him without question. But the balance was tilting, and at the center of it all, the throne. There was no heir. Roxana, now pregnant, carried what might be a son. but the future was uncertain. Alexander still dreamed. He spoke of Arabia, of new voyages across the sea. He summoned shipwrights, mapped coastlines, studied star charts. He even spoke of Rome, a distant republic rising in the west. His vision expanded faster than his empire could follow, and though the throne was never empty in body, in spirit it had begun to flicker. Plans unfinished. In the final weeks of his life, Alexander worked tirelessly. He met with philosophers, cartographers, priests. He reviewed troop movements, inspected ships, issued new laws. He was restless. Not with age, but with purpose. He had done what no man had done before, united the known world under one banner. And yet, he stood on the balcony of his palace, gazing east and west, and saw only more to do. Arabia was next, then the far western coasts of Africa, then perhaps beyond, but fate has its own boundaries. In June of 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill. Fever gripped him. He shivered, then burned. His voice weakened. His legs refused to carry him. His generals stood by helpless. Physicians whispered. For days Babylon held its breath. Then, on the 10th day, silence. Alexander was dead. The man who had crossed continents, who had walked through fire and storm, who had faced gods and crowned himself. One. Gone. He was 32 years old. The empire did not collapse that day, but it began to tremble. His body was placed in a golden sarcophagus bound for Egypt. His generals argued. His wife wept. His unborn child stirred in the womb, and the plans, so many plans, remained unfinished. The maps he had drawn, the cities he had dreamed, the unity he had believed possible, all of it paused, waiting, but in that pause the world exhaled, and the long return was over. Chapter 15. Death in Babylon. The halls of Babylon shimmered with heat. Outside, the palms swayed gently in the warm breeze, and the canals flowed quietly under the golden afternoon light. Within the palace, music echoed faintly, and the air carried the scent of oil, incense, and something older, something that could not be named. In a chamber draped with purple silk, surrounded by maps, scrolls, and half-drawn plans for Arabia, and beyond, Alexander of Macedon lay still. It had begun without warning. A small pain in his side, a heaviness behind his eyes, a fatigue that rest could not shake. The generals thought it was exhaustion, nothing more. He had marched through deserts, conquered empires, outlasted storms. Surely this was just another shadow passing over a man of light, but by the second day he could barely rise. His physicians were summoned. They checked his pulse, touched his skin, brought chilled water and healing herbs. But the fever worsened. His body grew hot and then cold. At times he shivered. At others he burned so brightly that sweat soaked his sheets, and he spoke nonsense in tongues no one could understand. They tried everything: remedies from Egypt, incantations from Persia, salves brought from India. Nothing worked. On the fourth day he could no longer speak clearly. He drifted in and out of sleep, staring at the ceiling as if seeing something no one else could. Rumors began to spread. Was it poison, revenge from an old enemy, a punishment from the gods for calling himself divine, or was it simply time? Outside his chamber, Babylon continued to breathe. Horses trotted through the streets, merchants shouted beneath awnings, and the wide eyes of statues looked on, silent and unmoved. But within the palace, the sun no longer seemed to rise. Alexander was dying, and no one knew why. No heir, no plan. The greatest empire the world had ever seen had no map for what came next. For all his brilliance, all his vision, all his ambition, Alexander had made no arrangements for succession. No official heir had been named. No council formed. No will written in ink. Roxana, his queen, was pregnant. But the child was unborn, uncertain. The generals whispered to each other in private alcoves behind tapestries in half-lit rooms filled with anxiety. They looked at one another and saw not allies, but rivals. Who would rule? Would the empire be shared, divided, preserved, or would it collapse into fire the moment Alexander's breath ceased? There were many contenders: Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus. Each had claims, each had followers, each had ambition, but none had the magnetism that Alexander carried in silence. None could stand at the edge of the world and be followed without question. Now that silence was filling the palace, not with command but with dread. Soldiers gathered outside the royal quarters, weeping. Veterans who had fought at Granicus and Issus stood side by side, stunned. They had marched for years, crossed continents. They had followed a man who never turned back. And now they watched his light flicker and fade. Still there was no plan, only waiting. And within that waiting, the seeds of chaos, the whispered last words. As the fever rose to its final peak, Alexander became still. His hands no longer trembled. His breaths grew shallow. Those closest to him leaned in, listening for any final instruction, any whisper of clarity. And then, as the air in the chamber grew impossibly heavy, a faint voice emerged. Some say he said, "To the strongest." Others say it was a wordless sigh, a name, a prayer. Still others insist he said nothing at all, that his eyes simply closed, and that was the end. The room fell into stillness. Time itself seemed to pause. The torchlight dimmed. Outside, a hush swept through the gardens and halls, as if the trees, the statues, the stones themselves knew something had shifted. Alexander was dead. No thunder cracked, no temple split. The gods did not descend in chariots of flame, just a soft breath. Then silence, and with it, the world changed. The generals stood in disbelief. Some wept openly. Others clenched their fists. A few stepped away in silence, already calculating what came next. The body remained still on the bed, adorned in royal robes, half Macedonian, half Persian. The crown rested nearby, untouched. They say his eyes remained open for a moment longer than expected, as if he too was surprised. From man to myth, the days that followed were filled with confusion and ritual. The body of Alexander was placed in a golden sarcophagus, set inside a casket of translucent alabaster, then sealed again. In another layer of gold, his companions argued over where it should go. Some said Macedonia, others said Babylon. Ptolemy would eventually steal it and take it to Egypt, where it would lie in Alexandria, beneath glass and marble, becoming a shrine to a man who had become more than mortal. But even as his body moved across deserts and waters, his myth grew larger than any city could contain. Songs were written in his name. Scrolls passed through hands in every tongue. Some claimed he was never born of man at all, that he was the son of Ammon, that he would return, that he had ascended like Achilles into the stars. Artists painted him with wings, poets imagined him conversing with gods. Scholars debated his final words for centuries, and in every corner of the ancient world, from Greece to India, people spoke of the king who had walked farther than any before him, not as a tyrant, not as a mortal, but as a figure shaped by destiny, a flame that had burned too brightly and, in burning, became legend. Even as his empire splintered, as generals carved it into pieces, as cities rose and fell, the name Alexander endured. In maps, in marble, in memory. Chapter 16. The War of the Successors. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, the world paused, but it did not grieve as one. His body, dressed in royal robes and sealed in a golden sarcophagus, lay still in the heart of an empire he had shaped with will alone. Yet, even in death, he was not free from ambition. His breath had barely stilled before the men closest to him, the generals who had marched beside him, fought beneath his banners and shared his triumphs, began to whisper. No heir had been named, no scroll had been signed, only vague words, at the edge of life, to the strongest. What did it mean? Was it a riddle, a blessing, or a curse? Perdiccas, one of his most trusted commanders, stepped forward first. He held the royal seal and declared that Roxana, Alexander's Persian wife, was with child. They would wait. If the child was a boy, he would be king. Until then, Perdiccas would serve as regent, protector of the throne. Some agreed, others did not. Within weeks, factions had formed. Rivalries old and new erupted like cracks in ice. Ptolemy, a cunning strategist and shrewd observer of power, seized Alexander's body as it was being transported to Macedon. He diverted it to Egypt, where he would bury the king's remains under the dry sun of Alexandria, a symbol and a signal that he would chart his own path. The funeral, meant to honor unity, had become a declaration of war. These opening moves were called the funeral games by later historians, but there was no sport in what followed. It was not ceremony, it was ambition, sharp and unrelenting. An empire without a center could not hold, and every hand reached for the crown Alexander had left behind. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus. From this violent unraveling came three names that would shape the future: Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus. Men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder, with Alexander now stood apart, dividing the earth and history between them. Ptolemy claimed Egypt, not through conquest but through cunning. He presented himself as a steward of Alexander's legacy, not a usurper. With the king's body entombed beneath the marble streets of Alexandria, he wove together a hybrid kingdom, Greek and Egyptian, myth and law, sun and star. He styled himself as pharaoh and general. Under his dynasty, Alexandria would flourish as a beacon of knowledge and power, lasting long after others had fallen. Seleucus, quieter but no less ambitious, began in Babylon. He extended his reach eastward, reclaiming the heartlands of Persia, stretching deep into Central Asia, even touching the frontiers of India. The Seleucid Empire became vast, diverse, and difficult to manage. But Seleucus ruled with careful hands, blending cultures rather than suppressing them. His cities bore Greek names. His courts welcomed Zoroastrian priests and Greek philosophers alike. He was not a conqueror in the mold of Alexander, but he understood what it took to last. Antigonus, known as Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, was fire where Seleucus was ice. He wanted not a piece, but the whole. Declaring himself regent of Asia, he waged war against all rivals. His son Demetrius was known as the Besieger, famed for his daring and innovation. Together they stormed cities and shattered coalitions. At their peak, the Antigonids seemed poised to restore Alexander's vision, if not in spirit, then by sheer dominance. But too many stars could not shine at once. In 301 BCE, the Battle of Ipsus brought the Antigonid dream to an end. A coalition of Seleucus, Lysimachus and Cassander united to stop them. War elephants trampled the dust, spears clashed, banners burned. Antigonus fell in battle, pierced by enemy blades. His son fled, wounded in pride more than flesh. The world had chosen fragmentation over unity, the death of unity. When Alexander had lived, the world had felt, if only briefly, like a single thing. He had spoken of unity, not just of land, but of spirit, East and West, Greek and Persian, a world where knowledge flowed as freely as gold, where men knelt not to borders, but to vision. That vision died in the mouths of his successors. There were no more proclamations of one world, only declarations of kingship. The great cities, Susa, Persepolis, Babylon, became prizes rather than capitals. Armies no longer marched toward glory, they marched toward defense, toward territory, toward vengeance. Each general claimed the mantle of Alexander, but none could carry his weight. Roxana and her son, Alexander IV, were hidden, then manipulated, then murdered. As long as they lived, they were symbols, and symbols were dangerous. So they were silenced. The dream of unity collapsed not in one moment, but in many. Silent assassinations, whispered betrayals, drawn swords in candle-lit courts. The great empire fractured into a dozen kingdoms, each ruled by men with tired eyes and heavy crowns. But something strange happened in the chaos. Culture persisted. Though the empire crumbled, its bridges remained. Greek art flourished in Bactria. Indian kings minted coins with Zeus on one side and Shiva on the other. Merchants carried scrolls and silk through deserts. Ideas moved faster than armies. Alexander's empire had died. But the seeds he planted grew in unexpected places. The empire that couldn't hold. Why did it fall? Why couldn't something so vast, so radiant, endure? The answer lies not in politics or geography, it lies in the man himself. Alexander's empire was not built like Rome's would be, with systems and citizenship and senates. It was not built like China's, with bureaucracies and walls. It was built on will, on charisma, on the burning star of one man's presence. He was a force of nature. But nature is not a structure. It is movement. And when he stopped moving, the structure collapsed. There was no transition plan, no second Alexander waiting in the wings, no institutions to steady the world when he left it. What he left was ambition, and ambition does not cooperate. The generals were brilliant, they were brave, but they were also human. And where Alexander had once drawn men together like a tide, they repelled one another like fire and flint. Still, the empire did not vanish completely. Out of its ruins came legacies. Ptolemaic Egypt became a cultural giant, home to the Library of Alexandria and the final line of pharaohs, ending with Cleopatra. The Seleucid Empire held Persia for generations, creating cities that blended east and west in stone and soul. In Macedon, the Antigonids eventually returned, ruling their homeland until Rome came like a shadow from the west. And across these fractured lands, one name never faded: Alexander. He had not founded a lasting state. He had founded a lasting idea, and that, in the end, was more powerful than any empire. Chapter 17. Legacy in Marble and Memory. When Alexander breathed his last in the palace of Babylon, he left behind no blueprint, no heir with strength enough to fill the silence he created. Yet, what followed was not simply collapse. It was rebirth, unexpected and uneven, but transformative. In the lands he had conquered, a new kind of world emerged, a world neither purely Greek nor wholly Eastern, but something new, something woven together from conquest and conversation, trade and temples, science and scars. This era, the Hellenistic Age, was not the continuation of Alexander's dream. It was the consequence of it. Though his empire splintered, the threads he spun did not snap. They tangled, stretched, and settled into the soil of history. In Egypt, the Ptolemies built an empire that looked both to the Nile and to the stars. They established the great library of Alexandria, where scrolls from every corner of the known world were collected. Mathematics from Babylon, astronomy from Persia, medicine from India. Ideas that once traveled slowly now moved with speed and purpose. Greek became a language of trade and knowledge from the Adriatic to the Indus. In city after city, more than 70 bearing his name, Alexander's legacy lingered in stone. Alexandria in Egypt, with its lighthouse towering above the harbour, shone as a symbol of learning and light. In these cities, Greek architecture rose beside Persian designs. Statues of Apollo stood near temples of Isis. Theatres echoed with Homer and with new, local stories. Cultures did not vanish, they met, they mingled. The child of a Macedonian officer and a Bactrian noblewoman might grow up speaking two languages, honoring two gods, wearing robes stitched with patterns of two lands. This was Alexander's unintended legacy, a fusion, a symphony, a spark lit not by governance, but by motion. He had not built institutions meant to last, but he had opened doors that would never close again. Legends and lies. As the centuries passed, Alexander became more than a man. He became a mirror, reflecting what each era longed to see. In some stories, he was a demigod, the child of Zeus Ammon, sent to walk among mortals and remind them of the divine. In others, he was a cursed tyrant, consumed by pride, punished for daring to reach too far. His name became both prayer and warning. The Romans admired him. Julius Caesar is said to have wept before a statue of Alexander, mourning how little he had accomplished by comparison. Augustus carried tales of the young king in his speeches, cloaking his own ambitions in the myth of the Macedonian. To later Christian thinkers, Alexander was a puzzle, a pagan king who nonetheless spread order and unity. Some called him the King of Kings. Others made him a villain, whose conquests were fueled by vanity and blood. In the Islamic world, he became Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one. a figure in the Quran who traveled to the ends of the earth, building a wall against the chaos beyond. In medieval Europe, he became a knight, a romantic hero battling monsters and seeking wisdom. Stories tell of him diving into the sea in a glass sphere, of flying through the heavens in a chariot pulled by griffins. The historical man was obscured beneath layers of poetry and parable. But these legends were not lies. They were lanterns, each lit by a different people in a different century, casting their hopes and fears upon his shadow. Alexander the Great had conquered cities, but Alexander the Legend conquered imagination. His image was carved into coins centuries after his death. In some, he wore the horns of Ammon, declaring himself divine. In others, he bore no crown, only the simple, sharp gaze of a man who had seen the world and found it wanting. His name passed through the mouths of storytellers, kings, scholars, poets. And though they spoke in different tongues, they spoke of the same flame, a boy who once wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. Whispers in the desert. The man who had crossed more ground than any before him vanished after death, not in spirit, but in body. For centuries, pilgrims and emperors searched for his tomb, believing that to stand beside Alexander was to be close to something eternal. At first, his body had rested in Memphis under the care of Ptolemy, who had stolen it from the road to Macedon. Later, it was moved to Alexandria, sealed within a magnificent mausoleum of glass and gold. The tomb became a place of pilgrimage. Julius Caesar visited it. So did Caligula, who is said to have stolen Alexander's breastplate. Later, the emperor Caracalla offered sacrifices at the tomb and modeled himself after the king. But then, silence. The tomb vanished. Earthquakes shook Alexandria. Wars raged, sands shifted, and the final resting place of history's most enduring conqueror was lost. Archaeologists have searched the city for decades. Some claim to have found clues, fragments of marble, inscriptions, hidden chambers. Others believe the tomb was hidden on purpose, buried beneath new roads, swallowed by time. There are whispers that it lies beneath the ruins of a mosque, or under a church, or deep within the sea itself. And still, people search. Because to find Alexander's tomb would be to answer a question the world keeps asking. Was he real? Not just in legend, not just in myth, but in dust and bone and stone. Until that tomb is found, Alexander walks somewhere between history and story, between what was and what we need to believe. The man who reached the ends of the earth. He began in a land of olive trees and mountain winds, a prince in a kingdom most Greeks mocked. Yet by 32, he had seen more of the world than any man before him. He had stood before the oracle at Siwa and been called divine. He had crossed the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus. He had faced elephants in the monsoon, deserts in the west, snow-capped ridges in the east. His heart beat not for peace, but for pursuit, for the next horizon, the next star to name. He was a man of contradictions, ruthless but curious, brutal but visionary. He could burn cities and then build libraries in their ashes. He killed dear friends in fits of rage, then mourned them with trembling hands. He believed in the gods, but also believed he might be one. And somehow, impossibly, he made the world believe it too. His impact is not in the lines of modern maps. His empire did not last. It broke almost the moment he died, but his influence outlived those lines. In the corridors of science, his shadow lingers, in the Hellenistic schools, in the scrolls saved by Arab scholars, in the Renaissance minds, who read his legend and dreamed bigger. In literature, he is everywhere, an archetype, a mystery, a riddle, the hero who wins and is still not satisfied. In stone, his face looks back at us still, from ruined columns, from forgotten coins, from museum glass. Calm, young, determined. But perhaps his true legacy lives in motion, in every traveler who looks at a map and wonders what's beyond it, in every student who reads a myth and asks what's real, in every soul who dares to want more, not for wealth, not for glory, but to know, to understand, to reach. And that is why his name still echoes, not because he conquered the world, but because for a moment he made us believe we could too.